Hello everybody, it has been a long time since I posted a video. My father passed away in December, so I was preoccupied with funeral and other things, and I was recovering my motivation to do the videos on YouTube. In today's video, I would like to talk about a social political issue rather than historical. Precisely, it is Russia's perception of NATO. My husband frequently asks me why Russians fear NATO so much, so I would like to explain the historical background on social attitudes towards NATO. Please remember it is just one perspective of understanding Russia's perception. There were three events or crises which made NATO a major threat to Russians. The first two crises were associated with NATO's airstrikes against Serbia in 1999 and then Russian-Georgian conflict in August 2008. And the last one was Euromaidan in Ukraine in 2014. One Russian scholar, Tsygankov, came to conclusion that recent Russia's fear of NATO resulted from NATO's incapability to treat Russia as an equal partner in the past. The alliance leaders consistently refused to recognize Russia as a power with important stakes in European security. The Kremlin's protests over NATO's expansion were ignored, while alliance continued to include new members and build new military infrastructure on territories bordering Russia. In the 90s, Moscow wanted to integrate with Western economic and political institutions, but soon stumbled over the West's decision to expand NATO eastward. Initially, Russia viewed NATO's expansion as a mistake, driven by the organization's inertia. In 1999, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland joined NATO. Despite the negative reaction to the alliance's enlargement decision, Russian leaders were initially focused on softening their relationship with the West. Western intervention in Yugoslavia in March 1999 contributed to militarization of Russia's perception. It exacerbated Russia's historic fear of the alliance and gave rise to a grieved sense of national pride. National pride or international prestige of Russia was attacked by NATO in that conflict. Because Western countries did not conciliate with Russia about bombing in Serbia, which was historically a Russian ally. And the attack was happening in Europe, in the region where Russia thought to have some power. Russian majority believed that the Western actions were driven by show of power and hegemonic ambitions, rather than the concern about Milosevic's actions against Kosovo Albanians. Among the general public, about 90% opposed NATO's bombing of Belgrade and felt threatened by the alliance's actions. After the conflict, Putin's attempts to improve ties with the West only served to postpone the next crisis. He tried to build friendship with the United States on the basis of fighting terrorism after 9/11. Putin even expressed an interest in joining NATO. However, after 2003, the relationship began to visibly deteriorate. Washington did little to integrate Russia into Western security institutions or address its concerns. The US did not stop at two waves of NATO expansions that had already taken place despite opposition from Russia. The second wave included Bulgaria, Baltic states, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania in 2004. It also worked on extending NATO's membership to former Soviet states, such as Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Ukraine. So the second crisis occurred with Georgia. Kremlin always thought that the color revolutions in post-Soviet countries like Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine were articulated by Washington. I'm not willing to argue whether it's true or false because it's hard to investigate this issue. I'm just stressing that this perception existed within politicians and the common people. So, Moscow thought that Washington's main objective was, in fact, to change regime in Russia. Following the NATO summit in Bucharest in April 2008, Russia reiterated that it would do everything in its power to prevent expansion of the alliance and extension of its membership to Georgia or Ukraine. As Putin summarized Russia's perception in 2008, we view the appearance of a powerful military bloc on our borders as a direct threat to the security of our country. The claim that this process is not directed against Russia will not suffice. National security is not based on promises. The public too reacted very negatively to the alliance's expansion. 74% of Russians polled in March 2008 said that Ukraine's possible accession to NATO posed a threat of the national security of the Russian Federation. And 77% expressed similar attitude toward Georgia's possible membership in the organization. This all ended up in the conflict between Russia and Georgia in 2008, and you can check the brief information about this conflict in my video about Georgia and Abkhazia conflict. After Russian-Georgian military conflict, Russian president at that time, Dmitry Medvedev, tried to normalize relationship with the West. He articulated a broad perspective on Europe from Vancouver to Vladivostok and proposed a new all-European treaty to establish a new security architecture by moving beyond NATO. In November 2009, Russia published its proposal for a new security treaty, which restricted unilateral use of force in exchange for European nations and the United States doing the same. The reset largely exhausted by 2011, the Western nations further indicated that they expected more cooperation from Russia globally, while the Kremlin expressed frustration with what it saw as insufficient cooperation from the West. The last crisis came from Ukraine. Putin viewed the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine as one instigated by the United States and pressured Kiev to stay under influence of Russia and do not attempt to join the West. Although Yanukovych scrapped the NATO membership plans and signed a long-term lease on Russia's military bases in Crimea, the Kremlin remained suspicious. With the pro Western coalition in Kiev, Moscow had reason to believe that they would resume its drive to join NATO and denounce the Black Sea Agreement that allowed Russia to keep its fleet in Crimea until 2042. To show Ukrainian authorities and NATO that Moscow would never tolerate the accession to NATO, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. Finally, at July 2016 Warsaw Summit, NATO decided to move 4 battalions to Poland and the Baltic states to be stationed there indefinitely on a rotation basis. It does not pose a really big threat to Russia's security. The 4 proposed NATO's battalions on rotation basis did not present a serious challenge, and military analysts recognized that the alliance was not an effective deterrent. Some scholars pointed out that since 2010, Putin has started to have obstacles to legitimize his continuing reign in Russia. Thus, the regime has become more and more authoritarian. The Kremlin now presented Russia as a special civilization committed to defending particular values and principles different to those of the West. During 2016-17, Putin made multiple statements expressing his desire to work with the United States despite Western sanctions against Russia. Nevertheless, the issues of Crimea and Ukraine remain key obstacles for improvement of these relations. And of course, now the situation reached its apogee with the war in Ukraine. In conclusion, Russia's fear of NATO has roots in history of the country's relationship with the West. Western nations' post-Cold War decisions served to deepen the historically rooted mistrust and fear of the alliance. In the early 1990s, Russia perceived NATO as an alliance of Western democracies that it was looking forward to join. Such view lasted only briefly and disappeared soon after the NATO began discussing possible inclusion of additional members without considering such membership for Russia. Several rounds of NATO's enlargement, military intervention in Yugoslavia, deployment of MDS elements in Eastern Europe, as well as the revolutions in post Soviet countries, all worked to turn the Kremlin to its traditional fear of the alliance. Partly due to the economic sanctions and domestic propaganda campaign, the solid majority of Russians view the Western nations as enemies seeking to destroy Russia and its leaders. Let me know what you think about this issue in the comments. Why do Russians fear NATO so much? And why NATO did not want to work with Russia in the 90s and early 2000s? Thank you for watching my videos. Please subscribe to my channel and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.